Welcome, folks, to another edition here of the Marc Steiner Show on the Real News Network. This one's really interesting. Not the others haven't been, but this one's really interesting because we went to Washington, D.C. to join Ethelbert Miller. Ethelbert Miller, he is one of America's great poets, and he invited us into his home in Washington, D.C. He's also the former chair of the Institute for Policy Studies, an activist, a thinker for 40 years at Howard University, running the African American Resource Center there. And his latest book was If God Invented Baseball, an amazing deep look at life in America through the eyes of someone who loves baseball. So please enjoy this conversation we had with Ethelbert Miller in his living room in Washington, D.C. about his latest book of poems. So let's talk about this. We begin with this. So the cover of the book, Satchel Paige.
Satchel Paige, right.
Chilling out.
Chilling out, right. Looked like God on a Sunday. But just to give you a little background, when I was looking for covers, I was looking at a number of different images. One was of Babe Ruth, because I was looking at, when you think about baseball, baseball gods and things of that sort, Babe Ruth, it has that sort of place in American history, American baseball history especially. So I was looking at some Babe Ruth images, and I came across this picture of Babe Ruth standing in front of the stand of quite a number of African Americans are leaning over, like getting into the frame.
Fans.
Fans, yeah. And I like that because, you know, there's always been those rumors about Babe Ruth being African American. You know, and when you put him in this context, he really does look black. You know? So that was the cover I wanted. And it was an image I really hadn't seen that much of. And it was fascinating that when you begin to look at the publishing side of things and the control of photography and how much pictures cost, you can see how you may not see that picture that often in, say, a book, because it meant a publisher would have to pay for it. And so what happens is that I went from the Babe Ruth to other pictures that the Hall of Fame that I was in contact with was willing to at least present to me. Right. So what happens, I came across this picture, and when I saw this one, a Satchel Paige, I said, this is it, because I like the fact that I had seen other pictures of Satchel Paige. It was always the same image. And so this one was one I hadn't seen. I said, okay, this will work good on the cover. Now, of course, some people think that's me with a baseball cap on my head, so yeah, exactly. That's what I keep reminding people, but you know, but I'm glad it worked. You know.
So I have to ask this question. We get into the heart of this. Was Satchel actually that laid back and cool?
That was that laid back and cool, you know. And I think that when you look at even sports in general, there are people that coolness is part of their whole image. And I grew up with the one, I guess, came through my father, Sugar Ray Robinson. And so when you think about the person,
great middleweight boxer,
but not just that, a man of style.
Yes.
You see, a man of style. And so when even you think of Sugar Ray Leonard and other, or even Muhammad Ali, the whole thing of being a boxer and then, you know, being a person concerned about their looks, you know, before that, it was always a boxer. You knew his profession just by looking at his face. But the whole lifestyle and things of that sort, the cars and stuff, that was Sugar Ray Robinson. And that was a thing when the boxers, as well as for women, the singers and the jazz musicians, they represent a certain coolness within the black community. And that carried over also to certain baseball players, you know, and I think of Satchel Paige as being one of them.
Well, we'll get into this a little bit in the book, but I mean, part of that coolness seems to me, before we get into your passion for the game, part of the coolness of the 40s and early 50s seeped into you from your parents, from the Bronx, because of baseball, because of all your metaphors about jazz and baseball. I mean, that's...
I don't know. Cool, to me, well, I do recall looking out of the St. Mary's Housing Project windows as my father was going to work, and my mother would say, look at him, look how he's walking, right? Even though when you would ask my mother, okay, where did you meet my father? They met at the Savoy, you know? So, you know, she was sort of a little denying things as she got older, but, you know, when I go back and look at some of the pictures that I now have, they were party people. You know, and I remember, I must have been 7, 8, or 9, my Aunt Connie, okay? Now my Aunt Connie, you know, I didn't even know what sex was, but Aunt Connie was sexy, okay? And Aunt Connie was my Uncle Roy's, I don't know if it was, he never said wife, but we call it Aunt Connie, right? Aunt Connie was the darkest skinned woman I had seen. You know, I'm 7, 8. She was black. Aunt Connie always came to the house in red, very tight fitting dresses, right? And it was always a thing where, you know, you're small, and you look at your Aunt Connie, and your mother's looking at Aunt Connie with a way that was not like her food's gonna be warm on the table, or when is she gonna leave? But you know, going back, I realized, you know, as I got older and going off to college and studying African American history, that here were members of my family who were pretty much part of the nightlife. You know, when I began to look closely at my father's like record collection, they were all jazz albums, okay? And that was the music that they loved. And when I go back and look at some of these pictures, I realized, okay, that's where my parents were. They were in these clubs. They were at the Savoy, you know, and that's where the beginning of my life is. I always tell a joke about how my mother says, yes, your father, he was a shy, you know, he was standing against the wall, and then he decided to come over and ask me for a dance. Well, my question to that was this. Well, what song were they playing? Because, you know, before the sperm hit the egg, this is my beginning. My beginnings in whatever composition this is that somebody decided to play that night.
Do you know what it was?
I don't know. I know it might be some chick web composition. But what I'm saying is that that's a thing where, you know, if you go to a party, you could be there all night long, okay? There has to be a song that you say, oh, well, you know, I've been looking at that woman, you know, and I'm going to go over and ask her to dance because of the song. You see, because of the song. And so when you, as a writer, I'm looking for these stories. And these are the stories of my beginnings. My beginning begins in that composition, okay? Not in terms of, you know, them getting married. This is predating, okay? But something brings them together. And for me, if I use this as an exercise, I tell writers to go back and look at, say, your mother as not your mother, but as your father's girlfriend. And you get a different perspective in terms of your mother.
I like that. What do you think about that one?
And why you're here?
Well, I mean, let's change the whole nature of our conversation.
They're probably playing some sort of music that is banned.
So, there's two places I'd like to start this. One is just, we're going to read a poem here in just a few minutes. And have you picked out one you want to start us with?
No.
All right, I'll pick out something. But your passion for baseball. And your passion for baseball comes from your growing up in the Bronx in the streets and playing stickball and playing in the streets, right? But it stayed with you, and it became part of your poetry. It became part of your way of looking at the world.
I think it did that because, along with playing, I probably had one of the largest baseball card collections, at least in my neighborhood. And so, you know, when I look at, you know, growing up, and you might recall at one time you say, do you have a hobby? You know, hey, I collect stamps. You know, you go out here and ask a kid if they have a hobby. You know, it's like
baseball cards.
Yeah, I collect baseball cards. You know, and that I think is very important in terms of that. And I would have to say my association with the cards had a lot to do with my father, who worked in the post office, and he had what was called the schemes, where we'd go and get these boxes for him to practice his schemes with how to sort the mail.
Oh, yeah.
And we all had to be very quiet, you know, when my father was like studying his schemes, you see him in the back doing that thing. And it was amazing in terms of, you know, what's done by machines today. But my father had that, and I guess also, you know, I'm playing with my baseball cards the way my father's playing with his cards. And there was a thing where I took pride where, you know, even today, I know the image of certain players from the cards, especially now because I'm older, and when I pick up the newspaper, many times there's somebody in the obituary column that I remember their baseball card. But, you know, I began to be fascinated by these cards, fascinated by the game. There were instances in baseball that defined a certain moment in my life, and it came primarily through radio. You know, listening to the game on radio, same way we listened to some Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay fights back at that time, and that becomes your memories. You know, that becomes my memory. I mean, I'm still remember Bill Mazeroski, you know, hitting the homer in the 1960 World Series for the Pirates to defeat the Yankees. I can still remember that, you know. And that goes into...
Were you listening to that on the radio?
Yeah, that's memory. Yeah. You know, and what happened, you know, I'm not from Pittsburgh, so I'm crying, you know. But those are things that when you think about the past, it has to come through different ways. And then there were things I wanted to do. You know, my mother didn't permit me to play in the Little League, you know, which would have taken me somewhere into formal baseball. I might have gotten better. But, you know, I appreciated the fact that, you know, when we moved from 938 Longwood Avenue into the St. Mary's Housing Project, we were able to have our housing project teams, you know, 665 would play against 700, you know, and those games were very memorable, you know, because of, you know, the competition among you being
Where'd you play? What did you play?
I was always very good at third base. I grew up, and people used to say, even when I was at Howard, well, what do you want to be? Blah, blah, blah. I wanted to take Clete Boyer's job as third base of the Yankees. I want to be on my knees throwing players out and stuff like that. And that gets back to the whole thing of style and class, and you're attracted to that. And Clete Boyer was sort of like me because I couldn't hit that well, but I could feel, and so I really identified with him more so than Ken Boyer, who was his brother who played for the St. Louis Cardinals. But those are things that become part of my memories. And I grew up with a friend of mine who was very much a Roberto Clemente fan. Then I guess because many of my friends back then were Puerto Rican, Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, and other Latino players, became very much part of my heroes.
So let's start off with a poem here to give people a feel for what we're talking about here. And where do we want to begin? There's so many poems. One of the things I remarked to myself as I was doing this was I had so many stickers in this book I didn't know where to begin. But let me begin at the beginning. Let's go to page 3 and 5.
So this is like a little hymnal.
Yeah. Now, brothers, we're going to go to page 3.
Right. And Sunday school's after. So I'll read these two, and I'll talk about them. This puts me in my neighborhood, the South Bronx, where I grew up. To be very specific, it would be the Marcenia neighborhood. This is the South Bronx. We lived in the land of broomsticks, stickball, played between cars, manholes for bases. We ran past fire hydrants and caught balls near curbs. Now and then, someone smacked a Spalding to a rooftop, making pigeons fly. And I can break this down. One is that if you go back, there is those historical pictures now of Willie Mays playing stickball. This is when he played for the Giants, and they played at the Polo Grounds. And so that whole thing of a well-known player, it's like you went out into the park right now and start shooting hoops with LeBron James or something like that. But those images of Willie Mays, playing stickball with young kids, I think it's very important because when I would come along, the players were not doing that, especially the Yankees. I was a Yankee fan. The Yankees like Bill Scarn, Mickey Mantle, you wait outside the stadium, they just push you aside. Today, you find that because of an agent, they want you to go out and do something, give away, visit a hospital, things of that sort. But to have Willie Mays going out in the community and playing said a lot about Willie Mays, and that image is the one that sticks in there. And then it's stickball. I had to go back as a writer to get the correct spelling of Spalding, the big ball.
You have to tell this with viewers, what is the Spalding?
Spalding is a pink round ball that bounces, If you put it in like water and stuff, make it really hard, it can bounce really high. And I remember, I can remember this clearly. One day in the St. Mary's Housing Project, a guy by the name of Mooney who lived in 700. And maybe I'll tell you this, it's two stories. One, I'm a poet. And I remember going to a party across town, Cleveland Park, Alan Chuse, who's deceased now, but it was Alan Chuse, maybe some other fiction writers. They had agents and stuff. And they talk around like, oh, you write poetry. And they were laughing at me, right? And we had one of those houses with a pool, so it was one of those type of things. And I remember going back home, and I felt like, I said, I can do this. I can write what they want to write. I went home, and I wrote this story about Mooney hitting the ball, which Alan Chuse took and put on NPR, because he said, this is beautiful. And what I did was this. Mooney, this particular afternoon, with a stick, hit the Spalding higher than the housing projects, the 21 floors that we had. We had never seen
that high.
He hit it that high. And what happens, man, I remember Carlton, man, everybody wanted to catch it, man. It was up there, man. And Carlton, man, was like, we're running to catch this ball because it was up there. We've never seen a ball hit that high. And we say that because Mooney was one of the best hitters. He just had a Mooney day, you know what I'm saying? And he hit it so high. And my story extends into how here are all of us in this housing project, especially Carlton, who was going to go to Stuyvesant High School. He was very smart. We all needed to catch that ball, like our future and our hope was in that ball. And that's what the story was about, And it's not about me hitting it, but it was up there for so long. And we had never seen that. It was like all of a sudden, Obama's president, something that you would never think about. We're going back and forth every single day to our houses in the housing project. We're playing ball every day. No one had ever done this. If you said, I'm going to hit this ball higher than put this up on the roof. Get out of here. Who's going to do that? And so when you look at these memories, and this one poem, South Bronx, it's captured there. And then on the rooftop making pigeons fly. I grew up at a time where many of my friends who were Puerto Ricans had pigeon coops. And some of the battles before, was just between, pigeons raiding other pigeon coops and bringing them back. And so that was one of the things where, my family, don't go up on the rooftop, and that's a key because the story, as you can see, is about the housing project. The pigeon coop and stuff is before we moved into the housing project. That's on Longwood Avenue. So I'm taking these memories that I have and piecing them together to compose this poem.
Right. There weren't pigeon coops necessarily on top of the housing project.
Yeah, no, right. No.
So another short one here on page 5. I'm going to talk about this for a minute. Playing Until Dark.
Right.
Could you read that for us?
Yeah, okay. Playing Until Dark. When we could no longer see the ball, we walked home sadly, dragging our bats and sometimes wearing our gloves on our heads, exhausted but happy, the light in our eyes, even stars could see. There are small things, that are very important, little nuances that you write. I have a friend of mine who's a woman who, when she read this, she said, "Oh, I like this out of the entire book because I really enjoyed playing baseball, when I was young, and I put the glove on my head when I would go home." I recall in my memoir, I was in Atlanta, a guy met me at the airport. He was talking about, "Oh man, I like your memoir, Father in Words." And he said, because you got that line in your book where you talk about your father putting this rubber band around his wallet. There's a small thing like that, this rubber band around the wallet that he identified with his family, his father doing that. And that's the same thing I think with the glove on the hat. There's people who love baseball that much. You're so exhausted, it's tired, late, and you're young. And that's what you do. The same way sometimes I tell people, if you see a young kid carrying a soccer ball, can't play. See? Just if you see a real kid who plays soccer ball, that ball, across the street, he's not picking it up,
Right.
But that's just a thing in terms of you can know how good a player is. The same way you go out here and you hear some kids going out to the park to play basketball and they're dribbling the ball on the way to the park. If you listen to their dribble, even before you get to the park, they can't play. Or can play. Because if you hear this dump, 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 can't play. There's no rhythm to it.
Right.
And that's just a thing where...
So is that taking the place of baseball then, in terms of going home after dark?
No, I think what happens, a lot of things have changed now in terms of one, being in neighborhoods where your mother and father would let you be out after dark.
Right.
Going home safely, having enough kids to play, baseball, as opposed to just like a pickup basketball game. It has changed. It also, I think, brings up something which is very important, the importance of having parks or playgrounds in your neighborhood. Some kids, have to go a distance to get to a park. And I tell people, if you are able to walk through a park late at night and have no problem, you go through a park 9 or 10 o'clock, you see older people out there, that neighborhood for at least a radius is a safe neighborhood, okay? And that people feel comfortable to leave their house and sit in the park to that late. Okay. If you see a park that closes down, has a gate, that's part of gentrification.
Can't come in.
Can't come in after 7, right? And our dogs will be here at 6 a.m. But this is the whole thing. So even a small thing, like if we were discussing this poem, it has a lot to do with our childhoods. Okay, and the very same thing, a little act like putting a glove on our hand is a sense of a childhood memory. That you leisurely can walk home. And you're a certain space between the playground or park and your house.
Yeah, I love that. That little short piece just that really, really, really hit me. I want to jump into some of the things because for me, a lot of this book really said so much about who we are as Americans. And there's a couple of poems here I want to try. One is let's start with The Boys of Summer.
Boys of Summer.
I'm going to maybe go from Boys of Summer, and I may slide into the trade. We'll wait for the trade, but let's go to The Boys of Summer.
Okay, in The Boys of Summer, you can see in
right?
terms of what I just said earlier, I made reference to the Bill Mazeroski in the 1960 World Series, and that's in this poem. The Boys of Summer. Carlton, Patrick, and I are waiting for autographs outside Yankee Stadium. The summer of 1960, and Mazeroski has not hit the home run, which will break our hearts. We are years away from memories of our wives and our children. On this day, we see Mickey Mantle coming to work, his uniform of stripes waiting inside. We run to catch the Mick, to have him sign his name on whatever we own. Our lives sheltered from segregation. Our mothers talking about Jackie Robinson and how Willie Mays learned to catch a ball while turning his back, running full speed as if he was Emmett Till. Now, you could break this poem down, One of the Boys of Summer, in terms of, baseball. That's the key part of the game. Carlton and Patch were actually real people. They were the kids, my friends, in the St. Mary's Housing Project. We would go to the games, and we would stand outside Yankee Stadium, waiting for the Yankees to go in, and we have our gloves or whatever to get autographs. During our entire childhood, the only person who was really nice to us was Jim Bouton, who wrote Ball 4, but Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, Bill Scarron, they played the way they were when they were entering the ball. There was a certain arrogance and certain like that. My mother, not a baseball fan, but a black person, she's a Jackie Robinson person, okay? And that's why when you talk about baseball, she was not a baseball, but Jackie Robinson was a person,
right.
And that's very important. So that's in this poem. And what I'm looking at is childhood memories, how we grow up, and things that we don't know. I didn't know about Emmett Till, okay? But I like to connect to the whole thing.
You didn't know about Emmett Till when you were a kid?
I didn't know about Emmett Till until probably at Howard,
Really?
Probably. And the reason for that, you keep in mind, is that Emmett Till's mother's decision to have the open coffin, which I think appeared in Jet magazine and things of that sort. Okay. Reason why that's not part of my background is my family's not from the South. Okay, my father's born in Panama. Basically, my roots are from Barbados. Okay, so if you look at in my house in the South Bronx, and one person that did this, if you would talk to my mother, especially on the phone, my mother sounded Jewish. Basically, if you were to bring members of my family in, even to today, they talk completely different from me because they lived in Brooklyn, in a small enclave, and so they have West Indian accents, okay? We were one of the few families when we were in the Bronx. The neighborhood was primarily Jewish. I wouldn't only research if I find out later in terms of how my family got there, but that has a lot to do in terms of how you are shaped in terms of your development. Things that you know and things you don't know. But that's what I try to get at in this poem. My family had a certain way of looking at sports that was different from mine.
It's funny because as a reader, reading that poem, my mind immediately went to Boys of the Summer in the Bronx or wherever that was, playing ball, and how Emmett Till was a boy in the summer.
Sure.
When they killed
Money,
him.
Mississippi.
Right?
Right.
When he went to visit family,
Right.
that was his summer.
Sure. Yeah.
Away from Chicago in Mississippi.
Right.
Well,
See,
a lot of kids went to, the people sent them down to South to spend the summer with their relatives, right?
That's interesting, and this is the beauty of poetry, that you as a reader bring that, to the poem. To me, there's a picture of Emmett Till. I think he's wearing a hat.
Yeah.
With like brim.
A fedora.
Fedora, right.
Fedora,
and so that ties in with Willie Mays losing his cap. And so those are things that I think when you break the poem down, from the Boys of Summer, what you're saying, to my friends, and then tying that to Emmett Till. And point I didn't mention, my mother never permitted Johnston publications into the house. She thought they were trash. So
really?
So I grew up.
No Ebony, no Jet.
No. Keep in mind, Jet magazine had a little
the center.
The center, right. So just
the woman in the bikini, the bathing suit.
Just a bikini to my mother. You see, because the key thing about baseball, the way I grew up, you could not touch a ball on a Sunday. Okay, you could not touch the ball on Sunday.
No playing baseball on Sunday.
No, not even looking at the ball on Sunday. and what happened? Usually on a Sunday, my grandfather would come to the house. Okay, and I realized, okay, this is how strict they were. Okay, and if I went out to Brooklyn, and we took the train to Brooklyn to spend a Sunday with our family, our aunts and uncles and cousins.
This is the Panamanian side, the Barbadian.
This is the Bajan side. This is like my mother's family.
Right.
They were beyond strict. You see, this is why I used to tell my kids, when I raised my kids, we go to the park, I said, we want to see the West Indian kids? They sit like this at the park so they don't mess up their Sunday clothes, And what happened back then, you couldn't go out and play, you know. And I look at it now in a funny way. That might have saved me, you know. There was no running in the streets. You know, me and my brother and my sister, we would look out at the other kids playing. You know, this might have had a reason why my brother went into the monastery and as opposed to other people. You know, you might say, well, I'm up here by myself. I might as well.
Your brother became a monk?
My brother, well, while you have the civil rights movement going on,
yeah.
Same time, my brother integrated the Genesis monastery upstate New York, you know, where they make the monk's bread and everything.
Yeah.
And, you know, I go back and I realize how important that was, you know, and what that meant for my family, you know, for my mother and my father to accept that they would not see their son again. You know, I'm just amazed how that went over, okay? And that's why I'm out playing baseball, okay? And I do recall, you know, coming back in the house and my mother crying, stuff like that, and my sister telling me to be quiet because I'm young. I didn't know what's going on. You see, you know, and I write one of my poems where we go out to LaGuardia Airport, and that was great because what black people went to the airport, you know, I mean, we were like bus travelers, Greyhound at best, and to go out, and that's when you could actually go out to the and wave at people, they could wave
you
at
walk outside on the deck.
Exactly, right, and wave, you like Casablanca, you know what I'm saying, you know, by Richard, we always have the Bronx, you know?
Right.
And, you know, what happens is that you're young and stuff like that, and I think for me, you know, writing this book, is draw upon some of the baseball memories, but there are other memories that have appeared, you know, not in poetry, but appeared in my memoirs.
So let me. This raises some other stuff. There's so much in here that I just reread everything again last night and was just thinking about coming down here. And can we jump into page 17 in the trade? The trade. Okay. Now this I would say this poem is only made possible because of two poets that came into my life. One is Amasu Bolton, and the other is Lee Howard. When I met Amasu Bolton in 1974, he was editing his Hoodoo magazine. He came from DeRidder, Louisiana. Fascinating individual, you know, friend of Ether's Knight, you know, was editing Black Box at that time. And he brought the whole thing of storytelling. He also brought the whole thing of science fiction poetry, okay? So when you think of Afrofuturism, all this other stuff, Amasu Bolton was into that a long time ago. I remember us, you know, talking about Samuel Delany long before anybody even knew about Samuel Delany, you know. So he was ahead of his time. The other person that influenced me was Lee Howard, who came out of the Appalachian Mountains. And I heard her read a poem, The Rape of Donna, on WPFW. And I didn't know Lee Howard, but The Rape of Donna, okay? I said, I've got to publish this. And I was fortunate to meet her, and we became good friends, and I wound up publishing the poem. But I always remember her sitting on my terrace in Alice Morgan, and I was just saying, I'm just fascinated by, you know, how you write and stuff like that. He said, oh, well, you know, Ethelbert, I come from a long line of storytellers. She just made this up. I said, whoa. And Amos would say this, because he's up at Howard. He says, like, what's all these people talking about folklore? We the folk, you know? And that goes into, I couldn't write a poem like The Trade without people like Amasu Bolton, Lee Howard, changing my whole way of thinking of my imagination, that I could make things up. And that's what this poem is, The Trade. Really?
Your parents call you into their bedroom. They've been whispering in your ears, want to hear what they hear, but you fear what it might be. Your mom speaks first because your dad always speaks second. You fear they both are trying to teach you how to chew your food, wash your hands, tuck your shirt, and tie your shoes. Everything is unexpected, like a baseball trade. Your mom says you're going to a new school, and it's the one across town, the place where the white kids are. You look down at your skin and notice for the first time you're black. You never wore a different uniform. You've been black all your life. You wouldn't change this for all the blackness in the world. You wouldn't change it for all the whiteness now. You give your mom a Kurt Flood look, and your dad nothing at all. You turn from the doorway and walk back to your room. You feel traded. You feel betrayed. Outside your window, the birds are chirping blues. Ma Rainey is singing about the Mississippi rising. Sam Cooke calls from next door and says, yes, a flood is coming, and a change is going to come. You know, now, you can just read this poem as just a, you know, narrative short storytelling. It's just a story about a kid, you know, and it's about school integration. You could also read this poem on a level in terms of the family dynamics, in terms of the mother and the father and how decisions are made within the household. But the bigger concept is the whole thing of trade, okay? going to a team that you may not want to go to.
Right.
Okay. So you have some kids like, okay, if you go back and look at, say, Little Rock, places like that, a lot of parents made decisions. I want my child to have the best education, so I'm going to take my child and help them integrate this school. Okay. Child might want to like to be where they work, you know. So that's in there. But what is the big issue? When you get into Flood, that's Kurt Flood, okay, who played St. Louis Cardinals, great center fielder, who challenged this whole thing about being traded, you know. It changed the whole thing of really players being in control of.
It was a black player, for folks who don't know who he was.
Right, black player who really challenged this whole thing of, you know, like, you know, you just can't be, you know, somewhere and somebody trades you without, you know, you knowing, your family knowing. You just can't do that, you know. And he suffered a price for doing that. And so I bring that in. If I don't go to Howard University, there's probably in the last stanza no reference to Ma Rainey. You know, the Ma Rainey reference comes in not because I'm listening to Ma Rainey's blues. I'm writing Ma Rainey into my poem because I'm influenced by Sterling Brown and his great poem Ma Rainey. You know, and I think it was the flood of 1927 in Mississippi overflowing. That's a key flood that displaces pushes everybody off the land. Ma Rainey, in Sterling Brown's poem, you begin to understand how Ma Rainey as a blues singer takes something which is maybe a singular or individual voice, but when she sings it, it takes on the pain of the collective, of the community. So all of a sudden people see this flood and this, you know, and their home's gone, and they're comforted by the blues singer. Okay, and so what happened? That song, that captures how people feel. So when people say, "What am I going to do?" Yeah, well, the blues or Ma Rainey teaches you that resiliency. Okay, you know, you're gonna have to face another day. Okay, then I take it to, I have to thank my sister, because in every household there's a battle over music. Okay, in my household growing up in the South Bronx, it was my father with his jazz, my brother with classical music, my sister. Oh, my brother was one of the best organists before he was like 19 in New York. My brother went to Juilliard before he went to the monastery. My brother was a phenomenal musician. So he had the classical music going on. Brilliant, yeah. My sister was in the, you know, the Motown groups and stuff like that, Sam Cooke, whatever. And then my mother was in the silence. It was all noise to her.
And what about Ethelbert?
Me, I was in the Paul Simon and Simon and Garfunkel, you know, Bob Dylan, you know, Buffy St. Marie. I can go down the list. Tim Hardin, you know. That's what I was listening to until, for some strange reason, I gotta go back and look at this. Until there was the English invasion, you know, with the Kings and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and then there was the Beach Boys, you know, the California Dream. Yeah, you got all that, because what happened. I didn't grow up in Harlem, okay? I grew up in the South Bronx, okay? Right around 65, I became one of the small kids snatched out of Paul Laurence Dunbar Junior High School to go further up in the Bronx to Christopher Columbus, which was predominantly Jewish and Italian. So you talk about baseball, out of the 35 black kids that were there at that time, 65, when it got to lunch, right? Okay, the best baseball player is who? Joe DiMaggio.
Oh, okay. Right.
This is the school I'm at. The best boxer is Rocky Marciano.
Right.
And
not Joe Louis.
Right. And don't talk about no Sam Cooke, anybody, because we got Frank Sinatra. This is what, and what happened, that was the beauty of, when I go back, it's a lot of fun. Because what happens, it was sports and things like that enabled me to go, you know, survive through that sort of, you know, experiment, which I didn't understand what was happening in terms of politically. Our schools were becoming integrated. Here were these black kids, you know, that were being trained, not bus, because we took the train up to the Christopher Columbus High School, and my separation was all the other kids were from Harlem. Okay, now I was one of the black kids from the Bronx, and so what happened
at that school?
At that school, you see.
So this fits into what I was thinking as I was reading this poem about the trade.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of black families were trading what they thought trading up.
Trading up, exactly. Right? Trading up, exactly.
Put it in the school with all these white kids, Jewish kids,
because
Italian
you're going to
kids.
get a better education.
Right.
See? And then, you know, if you were really smart, you know, like someone like Stokely Carmichael, you went to Bronx High School of Science. You know, now Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, others, you had to take an exam to get in. Right. But if you took my high school, Columbus, we had the highest percentage, I think maybe 90, everybody went to college. And that was when City College was free. Okay, and the numbers were probably pushed up because we had a large Jewish population in the student body. Everybody went to college. Okay,
And you went to Howard.
I went to Howard because there was one black teacher at Christopher Columbus High School who taught physics, who had went to Howard University. And so my cousin, who I played baseball, Dinky, who I played baseball with, he was older than me, so he was at Columbus. He was extremely smart, and he was into science and science fiction and stuff like that, and physics. So his favorite teacher at Columbus was this black teacher who had graduated from Howard. And that was the only reason why Howard even was a school of my choice. My choice of school was going to Columbia University, which my cousin went to, or Hartwick College, which was upstate in Oneonta, New York, because they had a nice catalog. And then my cousin convinced me, oh no, we should all go to Howard so we can find black women and find wives. Little did we know. But I put in the last thing, the Sam Cooke, Change is Going to Come, which is a famous Sam Cooke song. So those are things that are in this poem.
Dinky, this is a digression completely, but so that was my sister's nickname.
Oh, okay.
But I'm sure it came from a different place than...
Oh yeah, Dinky, Dinky was actually my cousin, and hates the more Dinky. But Dinky, father, they lived upstairs from us in the Bronx, and his father was like a member of like the UNIA, Garveyite guy, and then his son, who I began to know many, many years later, was Elliot Skinner, the great anthropologist at Columbia University.
Oh, yeah.
Emeritus, yeah. In fact, at my wedding, Elliot Skinner came to my wedding and stuff like that. But that's when I was reconnecting him. He was ambassador to, at that time, was Upper Volta, Burkina Faso. But that was a thing in terms of just having that presence in my life. Dinky was extremely smart. He was the person that got me into reading about Isaac Asimov, Herman Kahn, science. He was very much into astronomy, especially. Along with baseball cards, I think. We had our telescopes. We were also doing that. We had the chemistry set.
Yeah.
And
you had to have a chemistry set, man.
Chemistry set. Till one day we almost blew up the apartment. We realized that by combining sulfur and zinc or whatever and lighting it up, boy, yeah, we go to hell for that. And then the other Dinky story, which was not in here. What happens is that we're baseball card collectors, okay? Now what happens, and this gets into families, if you come home and you take your pants off and coins drop from out of your pocket, according to my mother and her West Indian beliefs, you don't pick that money up off the floor. You push that money into a corner because that means more money will come into the house. The same way, for example, according to my mother, if your hand itches, somebody might say, okay, what does that mean? Depending on which hand it is. If it's the right hand, it means you might give out money. If it's the left hand, you might receive money. So you got to know, you just can't be scratching. But what happens, she had this belief that, if the money falls out of your pockets, whatever, it goes in the floor, keep in the corner. What happened, a lot of money would fall out, quarters and stuff like that, she'd sweep in. So me and my cousin Dinky, when we get into the baseball card collection, it's like Fort Knox back there behind the sofa, right? So we start, like kids, man, just take a little, nobody will notice. Until I remember my mother, because we had in the Bronx these wood floors, and my mother decided here was a day to polish the floors, move on and polish the floors. And that's when she found there was a considerable amount of money gone from the corner. That was one of the worst things I think we ever did in our youth that we were punished for, because that was basically stealing. Okay, and now for us, it's like, damn, we got doubles, man. We got the same package of baseball cards. We kept spending more money because, we get them from the same place. Right. Like bad drugs. And so, we open up the baseball package with 7 cards and that pink gum, and you go through.
Stealing from Mother Luck.
you go to say, oh man, what happened? There's only one new player in it, so we go back and get some more money. Get another pack of gum.
What you just said here, that's important for people watching this who make from a different generation than we did. So the baseball cards came in bubble gum.
Right, with bubble gum.
You bought bubble gum.
Right.
And inside the bubble gum was the cards.
And what happened? The bubble gum was good for a couple of chews. It was something like Dentine or something like that.
Right.
And sometimes the powder got all over you and stuff like that.
Right.
But what happened?
It had powder. The bubble gum had powder on it.
But you wanted the cards, not the gum.
Right.
You see?
Right.
And that's what happened. But Dinky and I, you need to have somebody, a friend that you're collecting baseball cards with, or you're collecting marbles with. Those type of things are very important in terms of childhood memories, especially coming through the 50s and early 60s.
So I want to There's so much here. There's a couple poems I want to kind of. There's so many. I could read the entire book one by one, but we can't do that. But so, and if you have something that's really gnawing at you, you should jump out, man.
Yeah.
But let's go to page 25 and hit the knuckleball. Then I'm gonna go to Crosetti on page 29.
Okay.
All right.
This is the knuckleball.
Yeah.
Every black man should be born with a big mitt. How else can one catch the world that flutters in unpredictable ways? The sound of a knuckleball is Parker on his horn. When Ella scats, don't try to copy her. Oriole Hoyt Wilhelm in 1958 threw a no-hitter against the Yankees. It was like Douglas being Lincoln for a day. It's impossible to dance to slavery anymore. It ended with the hangman's swing. The knuckleball is bebop. Don't be baffled by its strange beauty. Just keep hitting it with your ears. And, if you're a music lover, you know that, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, the whole bebop, creating a sound that was difficult for people to imitate, so like, okay, you listen to Benny Goodman, we'll play this, So that's important. This book, because it's baseball, if there's one thing about baseball fans and baseball enthusiasts, they're very specific about records and points and stuff like that. I had to make sure I got my facts correct, that I didn't, commit an error. And so I did some research and stuff, in terms of, when did Wilhelm, throw this no-hitter. And
I remember that game.
Yeah, and that was very important. And then the whole thing in terms of just what I've been doing, a lot of my work is taking things and tying it into, historical references and stuff in a sort of satirical way. But it's a way that one can get a better understanding of African American history, American history. There's certain things that you can do and juxtaposition in a poem that creates a sense of tension, surrealism, that forces the reader to stop and think about things. It's just like, for example, I have a poem in which, Frederick Douglass decided to go get cornrows so he can be like Stevie Wonder, and small things like that is sort of a way of I mean, we see some of the visual artists doing this, where you take images and you sort of flip them upside down. That flipping creates a certain tension and a way of gathering further insight into history.
So this is a good point to kind of raise this issue. So to me, reading these poems, taking baseball, this uniquely American game, actually came out of the British game, but who cares? It's a uniquely American game. And using baseball, having baseball be the metaphor for America and for race in America. I mean, that's what you're doing with this here.
Yeah,
right?
And what happens, I think one of the things I'm really proud of, which is up right now, be up for a year, is that the Library of Congress has this major exhibit on baseball, which coincides with the All-Star game that's going to be played in Washington. But, when I went to see the exhibit, the day before it opened, I felt that I had moved at least into baseball lore. Like I had a line that people would remember, the same way, you come across a line like, oh, there's no crying in baseball and stuff like that. And in the exhibit, they have all the various movies, that use baseball in some way. And you realize, even if you're not a baseball fan, but you remember this movie, and this was a key part of that movie, but it would just have to be baseball. And so, I realized that the people working on the exhibit must have saw the review in the Washington Post, because the line is lifted from the preface where I say, there's no future without baseball, there's no path either. So when you go into the exhibit Library of Congress, that's one of the first quotes that you see. It sort of shapes the exhibit. And I felt, as a writer, then I did my work.
You did your work.
Yeah, I
know.
so
you walk in the Library of Congress.
But you see that as part of.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, and what I'm saying is that.
And well deserved, I might add.
Yeah, well, it's all the stuff that they borrow from their own collection, things that came from the Hall of Fame. I felt in such a way that was very important. The same way, I'm never going to forget the fact that, Dusty Baker, took time out and called me from California. And said he loved the book.
The ball player.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and the manager of the Washington National. He called me up, and then he reminded me that he played with Satchel Paige at one time in his career. So it was all very nice, and that says a lot about Dusty Baker. And I make reference to Dusty Baker in maybe twice in this book. And that's something that when you think about baseball and its importance in terms of, catching a ball at a park from somebody hits, or you're in a hospital and you see a baseball player, you know, oh, I'm going to hit one for you or something like that. Those are things. Like there's an image that somebody even used in one of the baseball commercials. And you realize it was going to be in a commercial because it was just something that was priceless. It was Trout playing catch with a kid in the stands. African American kids had his glove and they were going back and forth catching. That is priceless. You know, I mean, that kid probably woke up and said, okay, I got my glove and take it to the game, and maybe I'll catch a ball. No, you're playing catch with Mike Trout, okay? You know, not the backup catcher from the bullpen. And those are things that when we look at why baseball can seep into our memories and is so important in our pastime, it creates that. It creates the fact that, you know, you make errors, okay? One of the bad things about the instant replay and speeding up the game is that it gets away from what baseball is very important, you know? Baseball is a game that theoretically can go on forever, but baseball is also life, and so you're blessed if you make it for 9 innings, okay? A game can be a complete game if it's after 5. You know?
And in some ways, where you write this poetry, these poems, let me think of it, which you just said then, and I thought about reading some of the poems, is that's also our existence as human beings.
Exactly, yeah.
We may make these 9 innings.
Sure. Yeah, and keep in mind what happens, that it's not like basketball where you commit a foul. You commit an error, which is very human, okay? And those are things I think baseball reminds us of. And what we also say, which is mentioned often, you could come up 10 times and only get 3 hits, and you're really good. You're a 300 hitter. Okay, that means 7 times you missed, you made an error. Okay?
At least 7 times.
Yeah, right. And so, you know, if you take a young person who's looking for work, okay, or something like that, and getting down, okay, keep in mind, okay, or maybe there's something that you auditioned for, you didn't get it the first time. Well, baseball teaches you this, okay, you're not going to win every game, okay, you're not going to win every game, you're not going to maybe get the job you want all the time, but what happens, it means that you may have to get up X number of times more to get a hit.
So before we run out of time together here, and I do appreciate you letting us come into your home and do this in your living room, let's talk about fly balls and other beautiful things. On page 31.
Okay.
And then I'm going to pick out
fly balls in there. Okay.
There's so many pieces.
And this is just draws heavily upon history.
Right.
Fly balls and other beautiful things. Bob Gibson came to Nat Turner in a dream. He taught him how to freedom pitch and breast back slavery. A cardinal is a messenger from God. The arc of a Josh Gibson home run was what Harriet Tubman was told to follow. The voice in her head constantly ran the bases. Those of us who heard Frederick Douglass learned to step off first base and get a lead. He taught us how to avoid the pickoff and run down. His hair was filled with beautiful things. Now in this, you know, the tightness of the poem is a cardinal is a messenger from God. Cardinal is a messenger from God. Bob Gibson played for the Cardinals, so you have that sort of thing. Bob Gibson came to Nat Turner in a dream. Okay. What's interesting is that if you look at Bob Gibson, how he played, how intimidated he was. Okay, brushing at his back and stuff like that, and how he could also hit and stuff like that. He's the type of guy that if Nat Turner decides we're going to have our rebellion or resurrection, Nat, you're coming with me.
We want Josh Gibson.
We want this. Right? And the other thing here, the arc of a Josh Gibson home run, that's probably me borrowing from Amazu Bolton, because Amazu Bolton has a line where he says we were an arc and maybe a Hank Aaron home run, something like that. We used to work together and write poems and steal each other's work. We also are probably the only 2 poets in which a character that we made up is in his poetry as well as mine. We created this character, Bo Willie, that appears in my work and also appears in his work.
Oh, right.
There's a line that I remember we were crossing 16th and Harvard Street, and I asked him, I said, you know, I want to use this line. You know, it was a poem that he wrote. He said, I don't want it, I'm going to throw it away. But he was breaking up with his wife, and he had this line, red light in the corner of my eye when I kiss her. And I just like that line, you know, and so that wound up in my work. And that's a thing in terms of, you know, the relationship between writers. You know, like, only other person I have that with, there is a poem there's 2 poems that Wanda Coleman and I wrote together, you know. So like, I've got a part, she's got a part, you know. That I think is very important in terms of just collaboration. Makes it very difficult sometimes for the critics to come along and explain this, you know. And so I find that interesting, you know, to do that. And she's another person that every now and then I realized she had a different sound, and I try to make sure that in my poetry, my work is beginning to have a different sound, you know. And so I'm playing around with history in this poem, which I do in quite a lot of people.
You do that a lot.
Yeah.
But the sound of this one is different. The sound of these poems, the sound of these poems are like baseball talking to us about what life is about.
That's what it is, yeah. And you know, if you look at the structure of the poem, you picked out some of the poems go from childhood, and then you begin to see the aging thing. And so when you get to the last couple of poems, they are dealing with the aging, okay? If you go out to the ballpark, and I did this after I left Howard, the ballpark, especially if you know where to sit, it's older people. People maybe who still keep the scorecards and stuff like that. People who are not really watching the scoreboard, but, you know, watching the game.
You don't do that, do you?
No, I like to, you know, now because this book has opened the door where I get a lot of invitations to baseball games now. I've been seeing the games from different perspectives, you know, from various suites and stuff like that. I'm learning exactly how the baseball stadium also represents things of class. Okay, I remember going back in 1976. I went to a baseball game in Cuba, where you could just sit anywhere. Okay, you know, it isn't until maybe there's a rain delay and the last train, Metro's train, is left, you know, that you can maybe move down to a seat and sit where, you know, some other sits. But
the stands in Cuba are egalitarian.
Right. But baseball has a lot to do with you know, the prices and things of that sort, the closeness.
Right.
But I've been blessed the last few years to go out to the park and, because of friends, see the ballpark from different angles. Last year, a friend of mine gave me a ticket, and that was the first row behind the dugout, you know, which is it's a completely different game. You know, the guys are coming off, and you might as well be patting them on the butt, you know. But you know, I feel good about that because it means I'm still learning, you know, about the game from different perspectives. You know, I see things differently, you know, and that hopefully will increase my appreciation for the game.
So can we close out with the Zen?
Oh, yeah, and you know, this book, right? This book is pretty much, I wrote this pretty much at Blue Mountain Center, and it's Blue Mountain Lake. So
where's that?
Upstate New York, Blue Mountain Lake, not far from Saratoga. And you look at that lake, and that's one of the most attractive things about the residency, that you can go there, sit by the lake, or take a canoe and go across and stuff like that. And so I wrote this entire book there in terms of putting it in order. The Zen of Baseball. Maybe we should play baseball by the lake. The motion of water as still as a pitcher waiting for a sign. The surrounding trees standing like coaches and managers. Who wouldn't want to walk across the lake into immortality? You know, and that's interesting, you know, in terms of there are so many times something happens in baseball, might be a play or something that's not going to be forgotten. It's sometimes it's the image of a player. The same way we see in basketball, you know, Michael Jordan became the logo for Nike. You know, that's something. Or, you know, I mean, Jerry West in the NBA. There are things that sports gives us that become very much who we are, especially when we talk about America. And this is why, in 2018, when we look at baseball, and this, especially the All-Star Game, see it, the idea of building any wall to keep people out totally goes against baseball. Okay, when many of the players are Dominican, many of the players are from, you know, parts of Central South America. Okay, the best players. Okay, and you saw this when the World Series was in last year. Okay, the baseball will remind you, especially the Trump administration, you better do something about Puerto Rico. Okay, you know, you better make sure that in honoring Roberto Clemente. Okay, and keep in mind, Roberto Clemente lost his life trying to provide supplies and stuff after the earthquake in Nicaragua. He gave his life for that service. And you have to remind the President of the United States that Puerto Ricans are Americans, okay, and they need to be treated a special way. And you saw, you know, some of the players, you know, in the World Series, you know, with their Puerto Rican flag, okay, and
right.
yeah,
right.
And somebody would say, why didn't? No. that flag is also part of who we are as America. We're at a point now, it should be mandatory to teach Boulevard as opposed to just simply George Washington, that all of a sudden now it's the Americas. And what we're seeing, where the World Cup might remind you about football is an international game, baseball reminds you that it is a game of the Americas, that it's expanding to Japan and Africa and the next. But and that's a thing that we tell. You can't build a wall. You saw when we were trying, and we've gone back to this ridiculous policy in terms of not normalizing relationship with Cuba, that we had some really good Cuban baseball defecting, who went back to Cuba just during the time of the Obama administration because we saw this normalization, okay, that was taking place. Well, that's baseball, okay? We know that the Cuban team came to play the Orioles, right?
Peter Angelos did that.
Before, at a time when we didn't even want to, we were still, trying to make Fidel's beard drop out, So you can see that baseball has a message if we understand what that message is.
So as we conclude, is our message today in some ways, thinking about baseball, what inning are we in? Are we in overtime? Where are we?
We're at a point where we wonder whether the Trump administration is using steroids. that's where we are right
Trump
now.
Is Barry Bonds?
right, exactly. We're at a point now where somebody's messing with the rules and stuff. Somebody's messing with the purity. You're putting somebody who's the head of EPA who just stepped down. Why would you do that? Okay. Where's Jose Canseco to write about this? The conflict of interest and things of that sort. And what are we saying? And this is real news, okay? What happens is that's what makes baseball so important. It's real. You really don't, and what happens? The replay spoils that. So if the umpire made a mistake, it still goes into it's because the play was real. The replay is really fake because it didn't really, the replay, when you look at the replay is a copy of reality. It's like, remember when people were coloring by dots? Okay, did your foot really touch the base? That's what they did. But what happened, it stands alone. And see, and this is why, you have purists who want to keep people out and don't want to have the asterisks and stuff like that. Because what happened, there's something about baseball that you can't hide behind. Okay? You're out there and you accept this. If you miss the ball, you miss the ball. Okay?
Right.
Don't blame it on Obama. You missed the ball. Oh, Obama made you strike out. Who would do that? You know what I'm saying? Or now you're gonna call somebody from the bullpen to take away the female fans from the stand. Who would do that?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And this is where you have to go back. And baseball, in a small way, reminds us what it is to be human. It reminds us today in terms of what's so beautiful about the international aspect of the sports. You know what I always like? I like when Ichiro's speaking Spanish to one of the other players, right? Ichiro's speaking Spanish. Probably speaks better Spanish than he speaks English. But that says something about the beauty of the game. That in terms of the language breaks down and things like that.
Ichiro being Japanese.
Yeah, baby.
Right.
And that is so important. And to see that success, it's so very, very important. And keep in mind, we're seeing that international aspect where we thought at one time there were certain stereotypes where we thought Japanese players couldn't play in the big leagues, okay? Or if somebody, came from another country, they couldn't, adapt to this game. Or for example, it's not the New York Yankees anymore and Steinbrenner, and that's something that we learn from the game every single day, and we shouldn't forget. So it's more than baseball, it's human life.
Ethelbert Miller, I always love being with you.
Well,
thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for inviting us into your living room.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And this has been the Marc Steiner Show on the road here in Washington, D.C., in Ethelbert Miller's home as we talk about his book and life and more. The book, If God Invented Baseball, an incredible book of poetry by a man who thinks about politics, life, our world, the poetry of existence. And we've been doing this from Ethelbert's home. Ethelbert, once again, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next week from someplace. For Real News, I'm Marc Steiner.